good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending with where you're listening from. It's good to be back for yet again another episode of the Africa We Want, Africa I Share podcast, where we discuss issues that are important for the continent and also trying to come up with ideas on how we can make the continent better and we can contribute to the Africa We Want 2063. Today we are really going to be talking about something that is also linked to the African Continental Free Trade Area, that is also linked to the agenda of the African Union, which is the issue of a single currency in Africa. So we're really going to talk about the feasibility of having a single currency in Africa, given that there are other monetary unions, so to say, that already exist in Africa. We're talking about CMA, we're talking about CAMAC. We're also talking about the initiative that the West African community is trying to have to then have an eco currency, which is a single currency to be used within the Western African community. So I'm going to hand over to you, Christine, to talk about like what you understand with regards to having a single currency in Africa. Is it feasible? What are the benefits? What are the challenges? Just attack it from any angle you would really want to.
Thanks a lot, Chido, and I hope everyone has been okay. It's been a while since we've done the podcast. It's good to be back. So on this topic of Africa introducing a common currency. So first thing to note is that the plan is to move from the free trade area and then integrate more and more to a monetary union. So these conversations may be starting quite early, but it might be something that will come up at some point, and the discussions need to be a bit more serious on the issue. And when we speak about a single currency, why would that be beneficial? Of course, it's more stable compared having like a common currency amongst the 54 African countries than each country having its own currency, in the sense that the stability against, for instance, the dollar or the pound or the euro, for like the small countries which their currencies fluctuate based on like a number of things, like the exports they're making, which some countries are not making much, to the imports and such kinds of things. So having a common currency, the economies that are a bit bigger will boost it up even for the countries that are a bit smaller. But also on the same angle, there's a problem there because, like each country has its own issues, which will also be affecting this common currency that the Africa Union would be introducing. But the other advantage of having a common currency is that, especially for trade within Africa itself, you see, like for instance, right now with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, there's anticipated to be quite a bit of trade within Africa and amongst African countries. So the thing is that, let's say for instance, someone is exporting goods from Nigeria to South Africa. So there's the Naira and there's the Rand trading at different rates, and the exchange rates being different. So you see, like having a common currency within which to trade makes it easier for trade within the continent. And also think about, there's a lot of within Africa. The other thing to note is that, especially within the Southern Africa, of course, the Rand is used in a number of countries. Namibia, for instance, is using the Rand, but that's a different scenario in the Southern Africa side than the Eastern Africa and the Western Africa. Even if Western Africa have been speaking of having a common currency, the discussions are actually ongoing on that. But my point is that within a common trade area, having a common currency makes it easier to trade, so that you don't have a lot of foreign currency exchange differences, because those eventually affect how the business is doing and the business expenses for each country. And also the thing to say is that there is indeed quite a bit of trade amongst African countries. For instance, you find within East Africa, you find common businesses. For instance, the companies will be set up in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. You have common businesses around there. It will be the same like in Southern Africa, in Western Africa. So just having a common a common currency helps in that sense. Even if now, like as I was saying, the Western African countries are looking to have their own currency, maybe having regional currencies to begin with might be a starting point. But those are my thoughts, Chido, to begin with.
Wow, you really raise very important arguments or points, so to say, that I actually, concur with, right? Firstly, the idea that theoretically a single currency is meant to facilitate trade by lowering transaction costs and also facilitating the payment of goods and services amongst members. And if you then look at where Africa is now with regards to the African Continental Free Trade Area, you realize that already there is a whole lot of trade facilitation that is trying to be initiated, right? There is a lot of lowering of transactional costs and facilitation of smooth payments. So obviously the single currency will actually be a cherry on the topping to ensure that, we get to actually achieve deeper integration. And I think we as Africa, we constantly look back to the European Union, which serves as an example of a region that actually developed from a market to a customs union, right? So, and if you look at how the euro is, I mean, it's one of the most stable currencies we can ever talk of, and the single currency is really working for the European Union. Having a single market for goods is really working for the African Union. And I think what we then need to do as Africa or as a continent is to ensure that whatever lessons that we take or we borrow from, the EU have to then be modeled to ensure that they actually suit the desires or rather the nuances within the continent, right? Because I was then reading and somebody was raising this argument that, in as much as there is this theoretical understanding that, a single currency tends to facilitate trade, the actual impediment in Africa when it comes to trade is not really about the currencies or the exchange rates, so to say, but it has a lot to do with the fact that the continent still does not have what to trade, right? We have been saying this since time immemorial, from the first day we started this podcast, Christine, that the problem is we are raw material based exporters in a world that is commodity based, right? And we've got very few countries that have gotten to a point where they have started exporting semi-finished goods or at least finished goods. If you look at the ratios, you'd realize that the ratio of finished or semi-finished goods is relatively low when compared to the trading that is being done with, with commodities. So as long as we haven't really addressed those issues, we might then get to a point where we start saying it's not working for us. But I feel like we first to address what I would probably term as the lower hanging fruits, right? We then even start talking about poor infrastructure within the continent. We talk about bureaucracy within the continent, how that needs to be addressed first before we even start of having a single currency. And another thing, the reason why I feel like most of the regional economic communities or the monetary unions within the continent have actually progressed is because they've been formed not primarily for economic considerations, but also for social and political considerations, right? So we have got examples of SADC, which was really like when it was first formed, it was meant to help countries fight the liberation war struggle. So you realize that in as much as it looks like there were geographical considerations that were taken into account when regional economic communities were actually being formed. You realize that these people actually do share a specific historical background. They share specific values, social values, political norms that sort of bring them together. So now the problem is when we start trying to look at integrating the whole of Africa, we're talking about 55 countries that have got different social, political, economic landscapes. It becomes an issue of actually coming to the ground and letting go of some of the sovereignty that we have been holding on for so long to actually ensure that this works for the continent, right? I think before I get into this argument, because I really I'm so tempted to talk about why I feel like it's going to be a problem even for the ECOWAS region. I might probably want to ask you, Christine, to talk about what do you think has to be done within the continent to ensure that we actually realize the benefits of having a single currency, right? What are the shortfalls? What are the possible blockages that we need to take into considerations, and what can then be done to facilitate that, to ensure that it actually becomes a success. I really want to talk about ECOWAS and the CFA, but I feel like we really have to talk about this first before I get into that.
Yeah, I think first to begin with is policies. Different African countries will have different policies, even within a same regional economic bloc. Like they'll have different monetary policies. They will have different policies that when it comes to things like export, import, they will have different policies on how they are managing their economies, what the focus areas are, and they are so diverse. So you find like one country, for instance, there are projects that they want to focus on. Let's say, for instance, it's infrastructure development, which entails possibly a lot of foreign borrowing and foreign aid, where another country is trying to like focus on a different area and which has different financial outflows for the country. And then of the most annoying thing about African countries, there are African countries whose sole focus and dependency is on foreign aid. They don't even try to like leverage what they have. They just possibly just look to who can lend them money to fund their budgets. So, and that's also a policy decision that an African country has taken. So you find that the strategies that each country is using are so different and so diverse. Their focus areas are so diverse. And then now you want to use one single currency and come up with one to carry out these diverse aspects, which I think is problematic. And then also the other thing with African countries is that, as you noted, they have different histories. They have different, so you find like in West Africa, they use a currency that's backed by France. They still have historical ties to France, those that were colonized by France. And so you have a history there, and then you have a history with a different country which is trying to do something different. So our history is also like greatly affect the situation of our currencies and how we are doing trade within Africa. And then leave alone the history, the present times where someone is heavily indebted to China, for instance, and someone else is pursuing something else to get loans from another country. So there's quite a bit of conflict when it comes to like even on the foreign currencies forecast and like how our currencies are backed in the international market, and then also come to like what we are trading in the international market. There are some who are very focused on exporting minerals, others are focusing on agricultural products. So the impact in the world market is different, the demand. But the one thing that's common, like for most African countries, as you noted, is that we are exporting raw materials, but the degree of how much we're exporting is different. So Chido, I think there's quite a bit that needs to be thought through, and especially on the policy side. And even as you noted about sovereignty, that's something that you remember like a discussion that we had where someone was suggesting that for Zimbabwe to be able to recover economically, they need to cede their sovereignty. They need to actually almost give away their currency, adopt the rand, let South Africa invest within Zim, have them develop the industries, and then at some point down the line, they can take back the economic sovereignty. So look at that suggestion and you realize that might be what is likely to happen for some African countries. They will have to cede quite a bit of the economic sovereignty to like bigger economies if like a single currency is going to work. Yeah.
That's very important. I remember actually the conversation about Zimbabwe and how it was suggested that it needs to cede its sovereignty and actually get into the rand zone so that it recovers economically. And I remember very well there was so much outcry on the panel because a lot of people were like myself from Zimbabwe. But I really think that the way we hold on to sovereignty as African countries is it's more toxic than helpful. I'm sorry to say this, and I wouldn't blame ourselves, but I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we didn't have this sovereignty for a very long time. We were colonized, and we're trying so hard to hold on to it. I think you remember when we were talking about African leaders, about how they always want to hold on to power, and we said it also then comes back to that aspect. So I just wanted to give an example of what's happening within the ECOWAS region, because they are also attempting to come up with a single currency, the eco currency, for all West African countries. And I'm going to give that example, not from a positive perspective, but mainly from a negative perspective, to show how it's so difficult to actually try and have this for 55 countries. Because, I mean, the few countries within the West African region are not yet, haven't reached yet a point in their plans where they can safely say they are ready to launch their currency. So you would note that the single currency issue was started in early 2000s, right? You're talking about the 2003s, but it got postponed several times due to inherent issues that they could not agree on. And you'd realize that they came up with a primary criteria for which countries have to meet collectively so that they can then launch their single currency. And as I noted them, the first one is every country needs to have a budget deficit of not more than 3%, right? Then secondly, each country needs to have an average annual inflation rate of less than 10%. I don't think it's possible with most African countries. Then the central bank financing of budget deficit should not be more than 10% of the previous year's tax revenue. Gross external revenues with at least 3 months of imports must be available. And then the question becomes, of the 4 items that they listed, how many countries have actually been able to meet this? Like since the negotiations started, you'll be very surprised, Christine, to note that in 2016 it's only Liberia that managed to meet all the items, all the criteria that were tabled. So of all West African countries, it was only one country that actually managed to satisfy all the requirements, meaning to say the rest of them could not, and as a result, it could not be launched. And you would almost think that at least the majority of them were probably lagging behind at 3 or what. No, actually, it's believed that at that particular time, less than half of them were meeting at least two requirements from the 4 requirements. So that has been very problematic, right? And if you look at the factors that are taken into consideration, we're talking about budget deficit, we're talking about central bank financing budget deficit. These are very important issues when we start talking about currency. We can't talk about currency and not talk about inflation rate. And if you then look at the inflation rate in some African countries, I mean, it's so appalling. It's crazy, it's very crazy. I remember at some point in Zimbabwe in 2008, yeah, that's a bit of an outlier incident, but we would have an inflation rate of more than 100% every single day. Like it kept going up and up and up and up and up and up. So if then we have countries that actually struggle with inflation rates, and then we expect that inflation rate to be at a minimum for us to start talking about a single currency, I feel like it's something that's not achievable in the next 5 years or even 10 years, so to speak, right? And then we start talking about the CFA, right? We have got countries in Africa that were previously colonized by France, and they've got their very dubious arrangement where they use the CFA, which is inconvertible, which has got problems of its own. I remember very well there was an incident, I think it's last year, but where the Prime Minister of Italy actually had to call out France for impoverishing Africa, because apparently the reserves for these countries were still in France. It has been said since the 90s that these countries have actually been paying for France reparations in the Second World War, right? France has really been developing itself on the back of most of its colonies within the African continent, right? So when we have those countries, it becomes difficult for them to be integrated into the system, because what happens to their arrangement with France? I remember, I don't know if it's the president of Burundi or what, but in 2019, when it seemed as if they were very close within the ECOWAS region to actually realize the eco currency, he was asked in an interview, right, what it meant that they are not. Was it that they were going to move away from the CFA and then join the eco currency, or they were going to run concurrently? Like, the reporter wanted to understand the like how it was going to function, and he said, I quote, it's simply the CFA that we are calling the eco currency. And obviously that raises alarm, because there are a lot of countries within the ECOWAS region that are not ex-colonies of France, right? They were these are Anglos. And obviously that's not something that's acceptable. You understand? So that distrust, that suspicion already is one of the issues that has to be dealt with. And if we start looking at the rand union, you then start asking who is really benefiting from it, and that, I think, that's a conversation on its own that we need to have on an independent day. So I genuinely feel that there are a lot of issues that we need to address as a continent before we even decide to initiate conversations on a single currency. To talk about it, to blog about it, to write about it, from an academic perspective, I feel it's fun, but the practicability of it as we stand right now, I feel like it's really far off.
Chido, and I agree. And it doesn't help that African countries, just look at the conduct of how African countries go agree on something, and then you go on a different tangent altogether. So you sit in the African Union building, come up with a plan on what you're going to do. Then instead of implementing it, you actually not just not implement it, you go and do things that are different from what you agreed on. That would be even so evident with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, things that each African country should be doing. It's almost like the commitments are normally on paper, but the actual implementation of them, there's really no commitment to that. And I think that's what you're mentioning, like with the Western African countries, like agreeing, like for instance, the inflation rate, like the financing of the budget. This is what we're looking at. And only one country meets the criteria. And what did the other countries say? What did they say they were doing to help meet that the requirements? I'm not certain what they say, but you may be surprised that they gave no feedback. I mean, it was just a normal thing to have such a commitment, not honor the commitment, and live on as if you never made the commitment or nothing was ever required of you. So it's quite the scenario in Africa. And I think until all countries, actually, you have to develop inside yourself. You have to get the commitments done inside each country, and then commit to the whole of Africa. You may develop yourself internally, because most African countries are very inward looking. So they will try. You find South Africa is doing the best they can for itself, and it really does. But then it doesn't consider like the other people within the Rand Union or within Africa. So the problem, but then the other countries which don't even develop themselves internally or look to Africa outside, which is even a greater problem. When a country just does self-defeating things for itself, and then in addition to that doesn't even look at its neighbors, because the problem now is it's huge. Because now what do you do in such a case when someone enters into contracts to just sell its minerals at almost a very low price, and for what? Then the thing that you're getting back is something that completely a dubious arrangement, like even as you say about the France colonies. So each country needs to actually look inside itself, but also enter into agreements that are beneficial to the other African countries. Is that going to happen in the next foreseeable future? To be honest, I don't think so. But I think there is also a glimmer of hope, especially if the Africa Continental Free Trade Area actually picks up. There might be a case where a country looks at it and says, actually, this is working, and focuses a bit more on pursuing the greater goal of Africa. But I think, to be honest, it will take a lot from each African country, and a lot of commitment, political goodwill, a lot of it, which is very lacking in a number of African countries. Yeah.
Yes, I really do agree with what you have said, Christine, and I couldn't have said it any better. We have already exceeded our limit, so I think we can just wrap it up. I personally don't know what to say because you've really summarized. So I don't know if you've got anything to say, because I definitely know we're going to have a part two of this. There are a lot of issues that we raise that need to be, addressed, that need to be looked into. We need to look at what we are calling the existing monetary unions in Africa so far to see if they're really benefiting the members, all the members equally. We really need to look into the power struggles within the monetary unions. There are a lot of issues that we need to first address before we even then, conclude that it's a good or a bad idea for the continent. So I don't know if you've got any concluding remarks.
Chido, no. Although I think also in a separate discussion, we should discuss about the cryptocurrency side, because there's a cryptocurrency discussion for One Africa, One Coin, the Acorn coin. So, and also again, it's generating some heat on how the African countries would be, whether they'll be very accepting of like it coming from one country and then being used across Africa. Again, it goes back to distrust and that kind of thing. So yeah, we should definitely include that as an aspect of the discussion. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Christine. This was really interesting. I had a great time, and I hope that our listeners did also, or still would do have a great time. So we really value your feedback. Please get in touch with us if you've got questions, comments, queries. We are here to serve. So this has been Christine and Chido, the Africa We Want podcast. And till we meet again, thank you so much.
Bye.